people online can see Vicky.
I can see you.
You can, okay. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to the first of the seminar series for our Mapping the March project. So I'm Helen Fulton, I'm the PI on the project, and we thought we'd have a seminar series during the year to introduce various ideas, not just about our project, but the wider issues to do with borders and borderlands. So I'm very delighted to introduce our speaker today, who is Vicky Flood. Vicky is Senior Lecturer in Medieval and Early Modern Literature in the Department of English Literature at the University of Birmingham. And Vicky was my PhD student. She started with me at Swansea University. She came with me to the University of York, where she finished her PhD under the co-supervision of me and the wonderful late Mark Ormrod. So it was a terrific pleasure to supervise Vicky. Vicky's research has covered a number of areas, including medieval prophecy, the reception and uses of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, and investigations of medieval and early modern borders and cross-border mobilities of texts and manuscripts. She's the joint leader of an international network crossing borders in the insular Middle Ages, funded by the Humboldt Foundation. And more recently, she's been the PI on an AHRC project, Invisible Worlds, which explores the historical and contemporary legends surrounding Alderley Edge in Cheshire. Vicky's the author of many articles and papers, and she's edited a number of essay collections. Her first monograph was published in 2016, Prophecy, Politics and Place in Medieval England, from Geoffrey of Monmouth to Thomas of Ercildoune, which was a landmark study in medieval prophecy and its uses as a political tool from the 12th to the 15th centuries, still a much-cited book. Her second monograph is about to appear at any moment from Manchester University Press, called Fantastic Histories, Medieval Fairy Narratives and the Limits of Wonder. And I'm already looking forward to reading that. So Vicky really is the ideal person to start off our seminar series for Mapping the March project, with her interests in spatial humanities, borders, manuscripts and narrative. Her paper today, which draws in part on her Alderley Edge project, is called Ferlyes on Folde, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and Contemporary Imaginings of Alderley Edge. So thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Helen. Can everybody see me? I mean, you can see me on this meeting, I think so. I will. All right. So thank you very much, Helen and Abby, for inviting me to speak in this wonderful series. I'm aware that the work I'm presenting today in some ways departs from my previous research into ideas of medieval Britain and its borders, not least in terms of my current engagement with 21st century creative and public responses to the medieval. However, my paper takes its onus from my sense of the particular interest in historical environments that I understand to be characteristic of writings in the Galfridian tradition. That is, the tradition of writing place that stretches back to Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain and finds fresh articulation in works similarly concerned with the border regions between England and Wales, in poems like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, my focus this afternoon. So to begin, about the project I'm speaking to. So the research I'm presenting today was undertaken in the context of the Invisible Worlds project, which I'd like to briefly introduce before a discussion of the relevance of Gawain for this research as we find it, firstly, in contemporary fiction from Northwest England, and secondly, in wider public imaginings of environment and place. Can everyone hear me? I've got really horrible projection post-COVID, so I'll try and keep it up. Invisible Worlds was funded by the AHRC between 2020 and the present, and it explores the multiple and entangled pasts that have shaped imaginative engagements with Alderley Edge, a red sandstone escarpment and an area of woodland in NorthEast Cheshire, now managed by the National Trust. The Edge has a network of mines beneath its surface, leased by the Trust to the Derbyshire Caving Club, who in turn manage subterranean public access. It's also home to one of the most notable insular versions of the legend of the sleepers beneath the hill, who will awaken at a time of national crisis, when needed most. The legend and the site are perhaps most famous to the wider public today through the Weirdstone novels of Alan Garner and his most recent work, Treacle Walker, which blend the familiar material landscape of Alderley Edge with elements of Tolkien-esque fantasy and have cemented the status of the legend in medievalist histories of place. Alderley Edge is at once carefully managed and, in terms of its cited public-facing interventions, largely uninterpreted. In terms of institutional agenda, the priority of the National Trust is here, as for its non-built spaces more generally, one of environmental conservation and care rather than active interpretation. Although a survey conducted to mark the end of the Alderley Edge Landscape Project in 2016, a study of the site's flora, fauna, and oral history, called for the exploration of new modes by which its legend might be interpreted and made public. This is the call which the Alderley Edge Invisible Worlds project responds. We did so through a series of public focus groups and journeys across the Edge, as well as a new augmented reality resource for smartphone or tablet, integrating new creative responses to the legend and sharing existing tell material. We combined this with largely traditional literary historical source study for the legend and its medieval analogues, texts which, we suggest, make use of common environmental and place-based imaginaries and find distinctive echoes in contemporary attitudes towards Alderley Edge. Invisible Worlds is concerned with the wider implications of these trans-historical correspondences, both for our interpretation of non-built heritage sites and the power of pre-modern imaginings during our current historical moment of environmental crisis. There's a great deal I could speak about regarding the medieval sources and their contemporary creative and digital representations, which we've explored throughout the project. But my point of interest today, given our shared interest in borders, is the literary and creative conflations of Alderley Edge with Gawain country, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knights' imaginative relocations on and across regional borders in northwest England. Framing my discussion is a shared conviction among the Invisible Worlds project investigators, so Catherine A.M. Clark, Andrew Elliott, and I, that medieval narratives like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in their association with contemporary experiences of place, provide an opportunity not simply for thinking about story or pastness, but a way of looking beyond anthropocentrism. Medieval legends and their centering of place and the non-human provide a distinctive type of environmental imaginary, where the medieval might function both as a legendary signifier and as a mediator, drawing attention further back to the prehistoric past. So, the Sir Gawain. The late 14th century romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is explicitly concerned with modes of transgenerational, even epochal thought. It's rooted in the traditions of writing about the British landscape and its pasts, derived from Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century History of the Kings of Britain. The poem begins with an account of British foundation lifted from Geoffrey, who in turn borrowed this from the Cambro-Latin Historia Britonum, the foundation of Britain by Brutus and his Trojans, as part of a programme of settlement and building across Western Europe. The island is notable not simply for its resources, but for a more sinister class of marvel within the poem, tied to the remarkable qualities of place. We read, the Middle English is up on the slide, this is the modern English. More marvels have occurred in this land, on Folde, more often than in any other I know since that time, since the time of settlement. These marvels appear as a gloss on the war of violence and wonder detailed in the lines just above on the slides, a reminder of the contested nature of this space as we find it in the violence of history as it unfolds across Geoffrey's earlier text, and the strange quality of Folde, which here acts as a determinant of environmental and human behaviours alike. The central marvel of the text is the eponymous Green Knight, whose colour is perhaps no surprise given the poem's interest in land. While arguments for the Green Knight as a half-forgotten nature deity or a variation on the Green Man carvings of medieval churches are now largely understood to be without foundation, although some critics continue to find the Green Man a productive analogy, his significance is nonetheless environmental. A half-giant, a recollection perhaps of Britain's earliest legendary inhabitants in the Galfredian tradition, he intrudes on King Arthur's feast, bearing a holly bough and an axe, while dressed in a lavish foliate costume with gem-studded green and gold embroidery. We read that this silken work is too detailed to be described in full, but it's ornamented with birds and butterflies, with splendid green beadwork and golden threads. The description of the Green Knight, which spans lines 1 through 6 to 249, is itself too detailed to explore in full here, beyond the scattering of quotations we have on the slide. An extravagant blazon, it repeats just how marvellously green and yet how exceptionally courtly this figure is, and the difficulties faced by the court in just how to interpret him. Poised between an otherworldly intrusion and a hallucination, the Green Knight is beyond the marvels the Ferlyes of Britain encountered previously in the prologue, and the court speculate that he might be a phantom and fairy. The Green Knight is representative of the intractable entanglement of the natural and the courtly of medieval romance. Charlotte Palmer has recently read romance allusions such as this in relation to the ecologist Timothy Morton's understanding of the simultaneous significance of and breakdown in species categorizations that we encounter when we start to think ecologically, whereby all life is made equally strange. The uncanniness of the Green Knight, I would suggest, lies not just in his complex courtly familiarity and unfamiliarity, but that of the marvellous island of Britain itself, of which he presents a metonym, although in reality the materials here described, silk and gold, would have owed their presence to wider networks of Eurasian trade. The knight's golden splendour reads intriguingly in relation to the precious metals that earlier medieval authors, including Geoffrey of Monmouth, located beneath the surface of the island, and we might note gold's presence amid the green embroidery, with its images of flora and fauna, as a fairly in Folde. The Green Knight embodies the legendary imagined riches of the island, as these might be cultivated, enjoyed, and disputed, and indeed his curious presentation implies, as these might signify and even act beyond human interests. I begin with this discussion of the poem's interest in greenness, as I understand it, in relation to the historical literary traditions from which it is derived, not to imply that a singular contemporary reading of the poem and its signs and symbols recurs across its later uses. As Sarah Higley notes of David Lowery's 2021 film, The Green Knight, the concept of green itself is protean, and the exuberant vegetative life of the medieval poem becomes in the film the green of decay, of moss spread over tombstones, and the grass that fills your footsteps after you've gone. I ask then, what does the Green Knight, or rather his environment, his greenness, mean at Alderley Edge today? From the poem's macro interest in space, Britain, I turn now to the micro, its more suggestively localised geographies. Gawain country, as it's known, is an ambiguous prospect. The poem encompasses North Wales, Cheshire, and the Wirral, through which Gawain journeys on his route from Camelot to the Green Chapel. Although its geography is in some respects uncertain, as we're never told definitively where the poet intended either Camelot or the chapel to be. From a 20th and 21st century perspective, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight possesses a legendary status in direct relation to the Cheshire landscape. Not Alderley Edge, but Lud's Church, a deep chasm in Carboniferous sandstone known as Roach's Grit, a landscape feature produced by the same deep historical glacial movements which produced Alderley Edge. For some today, this is the Green Chapel. Although there is much about the landscape of the medieval poem that is obviously informed by the questing landscapes and weatherscapes of French Arthurian romance, there is a striking topographical specificity to its description of the Green Chapel. As Ad Putter and Myra Stokes note, the Green Chapel appears to be situated at the bottom of a valley in a clearing by a stream, identified by a small hill or tumulus. And then he looked about, and it seemed to him that it was wild, and he saw no building anywhere there, but high and steep banks upon both sides, knobbly crags with gnarled rocks. The skies seemed to be grazed by them. This is my translation. Gawain approaches the chapel on foot, contemplating quite what it might be and what it might mean. Then he went to the barrow or hill and walked about it, asking himself what it might be. It had a hole on the end and on either side, and was overgrown with grass in patches everywhere. And it was hollow within, only an old cave, or a crevice of an old crag. He could not judge which words might be appropriate. Our Lord, said the good knight, is this the Green Chapel? Here might the devil say his prayers at midnight. As previous eco-critical readings of the poem have emphasised, the shape of prior historical human presence and intervention at the Green Chapel intended by the poet is ambiguous. Gawain himself is unclear what terminology he might use. This is perhaps precisely the point. The nature of the Green Chapel, although apparently cut into the rock, remains uncertain. Is it a ruin, an abandoned church or shrine? Is the Green Chapel a pre-human landscape feature? Is it the product of human industry and or worship, or something in between? Gawain receives no answer to his questions. The landscape does not speak back. Instead, he hears the Green Knight whetting his axe. In the mid-20th century, Gawain's impression of the Green Chapel formed the basis of Ralph B. Elliott's interests in the geographical localization of the poem. Something of a self-identified literary detective, Eliot first published his case for identification of Lud's Church as the Green Chapel in the Times on the 21st of May, 1958. Notably, Lud's Church does appear to have been a place of covert worship, associated not with the demonic rites of the poem, however, but Lollardy. An association between Gawain and Lud's Church remains in public consciousness, and is a striking example of the active contribution of a 20th century scholar of medieval literature to popular mythologies of place. The poem has been drawn ever closer into the orbit of Cheshire and Staffordshire through Simon Armitage's 2006 translation and associated BBC broadcasts, where Armitage walks the North West Midlands landscape fictionalised in the poem, taking Lud's Church as his final destination. Importantly, for my purposes, although not a location in the poems, Alderley Edge is present in Eliot's wider sense of the legendary importance of the wider region, and it appears in the map of Gawain country, which accompanies the final scholarly account of Eliot's geographical thesis. Those are the maps up on the screen. To a modern eye, the Green Chapel presents a paradigmatic engagement with the environmental uncanny or posthuman, exposing the smallness of man. In the context of the medieval poem, it is Gawain's moral confidence that is here laid bare when he flinches from the Green Knight's axe, although we might wonder if the spectacular chapel in the chasm, even as it's called the Devil's, carries with it something of a medieval wonder at the audacity of divine creation. The noise of the Green Knight's axe on stone is a reminder of the wonderful quality of stone itself, ascribed divine depth from Augustine onwards. if not quite a conceptualization of a type with our own geological understandings of deep time. The relationship between the transience of human experience and the deep epochal qualities of stone is fundamental to the novelist Alan Garner's engagement with Gawain in his third novel in his Weird Stone series, Boneland. Gawain's journey here becomes that of the final Homo erectus, who travels across the inhospitable landscape of the romance, facing its beasts and its wild men, like the latter here presumably another species of man. At Lud's Church, the last man carves his pictures in rock and tells his story, initially in a hope to remake the world through its telling, a common impulse in the writing of place, but finally to acknowledge its ending at the coming of the Ice Age. The last man's final story, to an invisible, perhaps divine interlocutor, tells of ecosystem breakdown. There are no carrion birds left to clean the flesh from the last man's bones, we read. No one is left to hold, no child to teach, I am alone. After me, no one will give my flesh to the sky, take my bones to the books of the dead. The sun will not come back, the stone spirit will not send eagles, the world will end. That is a true story, said the other. An imaginary member of a hominid species who came to Cheshire in migration from Africa to Europe, the last Homo erectus would appear to function for Garner as a signifier of environmental change. The extinction of this hominid is generally understood to have been a result not of displacement by another competing group, but climate change. As the final man waits in Lud's Church, we read of the end of worlds, which he glimpses as he looks into the stone tool he uses to write his story. He saw the blackness break, and on the other side was sky, still night but flecked with stars. He sang. The light was stars and more than stars. There were pools that swirled and in them suns. The pools and stars had no end. They fled forever, and there were no songs to fetch them that he had seen. What matters here for Garner is the process of witnessing, of recording stories of extinction, even if those stories might in turn be lost. Incidentally, I should say that Garner is not a Cli-Fi author whose work might be read as eco-political. Rather, his interest is in historical space and place and the mythic, which lends itself to eco-critical readings and engagements. Elsewhere across the parallel times and spaces of the novel, Lud's Church emerges as a double to the escarpments and chasms of Alderley Edge, which is similarly reimagined in relation to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Colin, the child hero of Garner's Weird Stone, now grown and a researcher in astrophysics, returns to the Edge and undertakes a course of psychoanalysis, a conversation with another quasi-divine interlocutor, Meg, later revealed as an aspect of the Gravesian Morrigan and a new Morgan Le Fay. Through this, Colin reconstructs his own world, that is, the buried trauma by which his world can now be understood. He does this aided by his meditations on a stone, a lower Paleolithic hand axe Colin acquires from his supervisor, which, we are led to believe, was the tool which the last man used to carve his stories. And like the last man, Colin comes to acknowledge another type of ending, the loss of his sister Susan, his fellow childhood adventurer across Alderley Edge, who we learn disappeared with the Wild Hunt following the events of Garner's second novel in the series, The Moon of Gomrath, and now sits among the Pleiades. Garner eschews any easy Freudian association between the mines at Alderley Edge and the excavation of buried trauma, and instead he turns his attention to legendary paradigms. Colin retraces a legendary itinerary that recurs throughout versions of the legend of Alderley from at least the 19th century onwards, by Seven Firs and Goldenstone to Saddle Bow. This is the route above the surface of the site that might lead one to an opening in the hill, via a pair of disappearing iron gates, to the subterranean treasures beneath and the sleeping heroes who guard it. A new Gawain, dressed in his academic robes with their green hood, the customary outfit Colin adopts throughout the novel on his journeys across the Edge. Colin berates himself for his error. And this is the first quotation on the slide. Colin moaned, "This is the mark of the blame I bear in my neck. This is the sign of loss, of coveting and cowardice that caught me." He pulled at the hood of green silk. "This is the token of untruth that I've been snared in, and there's no getting out of it for me for the rest of my life." This is a paraphrase of Gawain's distress at the Green Chapel, where the Green Knight reveals his sin, his failure to disclose to Bertilac, also the Green Knight, the reputedly protective green girdle. Garner closely echoes the alliteration of the Gawain poet's Middle English, as suggestive of the deep regional associations, or rather assumptions, of the text's original language, about which Garner has written elsewhere, and the Middle English here is again up on the screen. For the Green Knight, Gawain commits only a very minor indiscretion, which speaks to the fundamental frailty of human existence, fear of death. The Green Knight tells him, "You only lacked a little, sir. You wanted loyalty because you loved your life. I blame you less for this." Yet for Gawain, it is a betrayal of the system of values by which his world is constituted. He believed himself a hero, but is revealed a coward. As the nick on Gawain's neck and the girdle becomes the hood of the academic gown, Colin's untruth responds to a very similar moment of self-knowledge and crisis or erosion of a value system. Colin's untruth here appears to be an allusion to his error, to believe that science, astrophysics, might answer the questions of legend, but who has become trapped in a way of thinking that is seemingly incompatible with legendary truths. In his final session of analysis, Colin approaches the gap between his academic knowledge and his lived experience of the legend, a wry caution to researchers of the Edge. He suggests that he attempted to understand a metaphor with a telescope, concluding, "Both systems can be real, but both are models. You can't or shouldn't confuse them. I did." Yet the two systems remain in a productive dialogue in some respects, mediated by the archaic wonders of romance. Meg describes the telescope of the observatory at Jodrell Bank, a few miles from Alderley Edge, as a goblet, even a chalice. It could be the Grail. Although we might note that in Arthurian legend, the Grail was only attainable by one knight, and it was not Colin's avatar, Gawain. Colin replies, it is a questing tool. The telescope at Jodrell Bank is, after all, named Merlin, Merlin, an association of which much is made in contemporary reimaginings of legendary content at Alderley Edge. Nearing the end of psychoanalysis, Meg asks Colin what he will do now, and this is the second quotation on the screen. "Get back to my work. There's so much to be done. So much," Colin began to cry. "So much, the wonders." "And that's how you start to squeeze," said Meg. The wonders of the medieval poem's prologue, its Ferlyes on Folde, are here reimagined in explicit relation to the geological and the subterranean, the process by which diamonds are made. Colin's encounter with deep time is repetitious, doubled, like the landscapes and its repeating geological features. Boneland traces those discourses by which we might perceive time, beyond the life not only of individual man, but of hominid species, universes in rock uncovered and discovered anew, each time bearing the weight of vast forgotten histories. Which brings me to part 3, community narratives. An affinity between research and metaphors and experiences of excavation and discovery recurs throughout Garner's novel. We read that the prehistoric stone is a tool which ought to have been buried deeply, but was found in the topsoil. Garner is not alone in this perception. We've heard throughout the Invisible Worlds project interviews with local stakeholders of how Alderley Edge discloses its treasures, but in a manner that is unexpected and is not so much whimsical as it is revelatory. We might note the enthusiastic local recording of the various archaeological finds that Alderley Edge has apparently revealed to those looking on a hunch, not least as if it was something out of a children's fantasy novel to children. We might note also those items pulled from the earth by treasure hunters of all ages, such as this shoe. It's from the 1950s. It was presented by Mark, a pseudonym which I use for all project participants in keeping with the terms of our ethical review. Mark presented this alongside a number of other finds to the attendees of the first Perception of the Edge focus group in July 2021. Look, a piece of leather from the sole of a boot. I bring it to your attention here, ladies and gentlemen, for your marvelling and your amazement. Isn't it wonderful? The context of Mark's presentation of the shoe was a reflection on the wonderful preservative properties of the polluted soil by the hag cottages, the cottages built for the families of the mines foremen in the mid-18th century. In the 1850s, waste sand from the acid leaching processes used to extract the copper ore were dumped here and appear to have acquired a reputation for remarkable preservative properties. Mark continues, what I love about these things is I've imbued them with a sense of magic that I inherited from being a childhood lover of the Edge. I was born and raised here, and I've been on the Edge weekly for my entire life. So these are my treasures from beneath the hill, and I love to show them to visitors when they arrive. So it's almost like the continuity of the legend in different forms. The wider question of thing and function, held in relation to history and environment, informs Alan Garner's writings also. Garner is particularly concerned with the ways in which one might ask the right or wrong questions about place and its objects. In Bowland, Collins psychiatrist Meg asks, what is a thing? What does it mean? Whom does it serve? If those medieval adolescents of the Round Table had asked the question straight off, a lot of knights would have been out of a job quick smart. These are, of course, the fundamental questions of the seeker and the finder, the amateur archaeologist among them. Among his treasures, Mark produced a mystery object, a small clay pipe. First of all, what have I got here? Okay, it's a thing, and I don't know what it is. It looks like something that an apothecary might have, or a chemist. Or it could be a tiny elven pipe that is smoked by one of the strange creatures that live underground on the edge, but I don't know. There it is, and the best thing about it, it was buried under the soil and perfect. It is unblemished, it is unbroken. Heaven knows what it is, but there it is. So I really like that, and I've yet to find anybody who can offer me a solution as to what it could be. The curious inhabitant of the Edge asks questions of this remarkable place, and Garner's Colin asks the wrong ones. The precedent of the knight's failure, and we might remember that in the wider context of the medieval Arthurian tradition, again, Gawain fails the Grail quest, looms large in Colin's experience. To fail to ask the obvious question, to accept received knowledge and the ascription of value without any consideration, is, Garner implies in Boneland, an act of hubris, similar to that of Gawain, who thought he would not flinch at the axe's stroke, and yet did. In Colin's case, this belies a certain obliviousness to the deeper mythic meanings of the phenomenon studied. In contemporary legendary accounts from Alderley Edge, we find a strong sense of the legendary or the mythic qualities of space, an interest which for some has decidedly high environmental stakes. The relationship between environmental writing and storytelling finds eloquent expression in the writings of Amitav Ghosh on contemporary failures of imagination in the comprehension of environmentalism. Ghosh's primary interest is in the rehabilitation of literary fiction, which, unlike fantasy or science fiction, holds little room for the unexpected, the marvellous outliers. But his remarks are most useful for my purposes in his understanding of the capabilities of earlier literary forms in perceptions of environmental marvels, which he draws closer to storytelling than the novel. He writes, before the birth of the modern novel, wherever stories were told, fiction delighted in the unheard of and the unlikely. Narratives like those of the Arabian Nights, the journeys to the West, and the Decameron proceeded by leaping blithely from one exceptional event to another. This, after all, is how storytelling must necessarily proceed, inasmuch as it is a recounting of what happened. For such an inquiry can only arise in relation to something out of the ordinary, which is but another way of saying exceptional or unlikely. I should say I'm very aware that medievalists do and have, and I myself have elsewhere, taken issue with this idea that the medieval is exceptional in this respect, and that we have a type of realist fiction which doesn't emerge until the novel. We know that this is a problematic view, but we know it's also one that a large number of members of the public and fantasy authors hold in relation to the medieval. So please indulge me with this association. Because this characterization coheres particularly closely with the pre-modern genre, by which we might identify certain elements of the medieval tale collections noted by Bush. A set of conventions which we've seen mapped strikingly closely onto the writings of the Edge and its environment, romance. Within romance, we find the suspension of disbelief common to fairy tales, generally coupled with an increased interest in the emotional experience of the protagonist in response to the wonders of their environment. And I turn now to another stakeholder interview at Alderley Edge, which shows a different type of mythic or legendary engagement with the natural world, this time with, among others, figures which are decidedly familiar to me and to you, I hope, as readers of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Ferlyes. One of my final interviews with local stakeholders at Alderley Edge, for our current write-up of the project, was in June 2023. And this included an interview with Joan and Linda, as with Mark, I'm using pseudonyms here. The two are friends who have been working together, practicing magic, at Alderley Edge for the last few years. Joan identifies as a witch, Linda prefers no label. Both tell me this is the subject of an ongoing conversation. The two grew up in the area and read Weirdstone at school. Both read the book to their children and now their grandchildren. Joan recalls meeting Alan Garner as an adult and joking with him that his books, read by the flashing light of her mother's pilgrimage memento, a Mary of Lourdes statue lamp, ruined her eyesight. Garner told her that he used to hide underneath the stairs and read by the hall light. It's a book, Linda reflects, that spoke to her already established sense of place. She tells us, I grew up in the area around here, and it was the first story that grabbed me spiritually. Even as a child, I got the spiritual side of it. The two now use the Edge to collect ingredients for tinctures, a type of bottling of the spirit of place, intended to draw the body and the environment into alignment. Their description of this practice for our interview, in which the two emphasize its ethical urgency, begins with Joan's account of a spirit, who she describes, among other synonyms, he is, like the Green Knight, difficult to categorize, as a fairy, although she's initially reluctant to name him this for fear, I think, that I'll laugh. And I felt a spirit here a lot, and he spent some time with me, but he's not a spirit like a dead person, it's more elemental, I think. And I think now is the time, even if people think we're potty, now's the time to share what we feel and how we work with the land and stuff, because the planet needs saving, that Linda interjects. The more people who work together to heal the land, the better, because we're at a turning point, and we really do need to look to future generations. So that's basically what we're doing here. It's about spreading this information through, because a lot of people are like, this is mine and I'm not sharing it. And you can't be like that now. Time's moving too fast. I asked, do you mean in terms of spiritual experience or knowledge in terms of information sharing? Joan replies, well, spiritual experience, but also practical things you can do. For example, we both make essences. We make them differently, but we both make them. And people get a lot from that. And it's about the spirit of place a lot of the time. Well, I've met somebody else and she's working to do the same along the same line. People are becoming more connected, and we, she said, do you think we should set up a network for people? There must be a lot more people than us working along those lines and share the information. And I think if people have a greater understanding of the land, they'll learn to appreciate it more. It worries me. Joe's words are resonant. I get the sense that even a few years ago, like my other interviewees, she and Linda would have been reluctant to talk to me. It perhaps helps that my field of study is narrative construction and place. I'm clear I do not intend to prove or disprove the magic of the edge. And I have immense admiration for my interviewees and their dedication to this place. What has changed the most, however, I suspect, is not the interviewer, but the circumstances. There is a sense of urgency here. What does it matter if people think you are silly, if you believe it can affect positive environmental change? Don't you have an ethical imperative to share this information? This is actually not so far away from the impetus behind the Invisible Worlds project itself. The thesis that increased public respect for the legendary aspects of the site has the potential to encourage more sustainable, environmentally friendly behaviours. This has long been the aspiration of many of the witches, pagans, and magic workers of Alderley Edge, a small but significant cohort of local stakeholders who, as is largely typical of contemporary magical understandings, on occasion think with metaphors drawn from medieval romance, among other legendary and mythic materials. My interviewees for the project demonstrate the highly contemporary understanding of human nature connections and responsibilities, which actually comes very close to that articulated by Donna J. Haraway's concept of the Thulucene, as we find it in her 2016 book, Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Thulucene. Haraway here refers to the importance of staying in our present moment, the trouble, resisting the banal evil of ecocidal complicity or despairing inaction, both for her profound failures of imagination, and cultivating meaningful cross-species affiliations that look beyond the limited imaginings of the Anthropocene. This work marks Haraway's movement away from the post-human to what she calls compostism, an engagement with human nature entanglements, which decenters the human entirely, contending that human beings are with and of the earth, and the biotic and abiotic powers of the earth are the main story. Haraway uses this Thulucene as a kind of what she calls a kind of time place for living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth. She's alert to the metaphorical power of the chthonic, the underground, and the humus, beyond the human, of which the human is a part. Chthonic ones are beings of the earth, both ancient and up to the minute. I imagine chthonic ones as replete with tentacles, feelers, digits, cords, whiptail, spider legs, and very unruly hair. Chthonic ones romp in multi-critter humus. They have no truck with sky-gazing armor. Chthonic ones are monsters in the best sense. They demonstrate and perform the material meaningfulness of Earth. This commonality with my interviewees is no coincidence. Haraway's conceptualization is certainly influenced by concepts like Gaia, a personified understanding of the animate Earth as an integrated whole, which she shares with many modern pagans. Although my interviewees also share with Haraway an acute sense of the contemporary urgency of such engagements, poised between the environmental and the mythic. This type of response is not unique to Alderley Edge, of course, and the types of medievalist entanglements with which I'm concerned adhere elsewhere. So I'd like to conclude with Robert Macfarlane and Stanley Donwood's experimental prose poem, Ness. This is a creative response to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, displaced from its conventional northwestern geographies to Orford Ness in East Anglia, a military testing site, which here becomes a new Green Chapel. In the passage with which I want to conclude, the Green Knight whetting his axe has become the armourer, the agent of nuclear war. For Macfarlane, green is the glow of the atomic bomb, and his Green Chapel is a site of a future chasm covered over with layers of bone, fossil, and rock, by which the hubris and temporal limits of the Anthropocene are laid bare. The light in the chapel is now a deep green, a moss green, the green where shadow meets leaf. Armourer, can you not see that we are being buried from the day? We are now down past the plastic, the sea coal, the flip-flops, down through the flints, the quartzites, the hags, and down to the imprintation relic-yielding clay. We are among the bracelet class, spindle walls, a whalebone table. We are among fossils, the mammoths, the turtles, the sharks, the nautilus, the wing bone of the albatross, the ear bone of the eagle rayed. He pauses. Armourer, we are deep in matter, and this far down it is hard to transmit. Messages can't make it, signals shatter, detonation is impossible. Thought is, language is, turning to shingle. The presence of plastic oil and flip-flops raised the Anthropocene to the dubious status of a geological era, such is the difference human activity has made to the composition of the rock. These debris are submerged above medieval grave goods and the fossils of ancient animals, a collision of terms largely characteristic of medieval mediation in geological imaginaries that we've encountered similar at Alderley Edge. The medieval takes us deeper away from the time of the living and indeed the human, all the way back to the mammoth and the point where language breaks down and turns to shingle. My paper to date has been, and these are my selected sources for the UKRI I've been working with, my paper has been intended to point to medieval legendary and literary legacies at Alderley Edge, as well as inevitably within our wider cultural context. On occasion, the reception is strikingly direct. Alan Garner is not reimagining Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by accident. We know that he corresponded with Ralph Elliott, the two were friends. There's a very direct line here. But there are other less direct commonalities and shared habits of thought between the medieval and the modern, mediated via the capacity of legendary imaginaries with their roots in the medieval and mediated via authors like Garner. Not simply to remake or reinterpret place, but to speak to the very high stakes of doing so in a time of environmental urgency. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for that really wonderful paper. It was sort of quite translating, you know, translated us to another place entirely. So that was really fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions and comments for you from within the room and perhaps online as well. I wonder if people online might actually type their questions into the chat. That's probably the best place to put them. And we can come back to the questions in the chat in a minute when people have had time to type them. So I'll turn to the room here and ask if anyone has any questions or comments for Vicky. Sebastian.
Hi, Vicky. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Can I ask a really simple question based on my ignorance of this place? Alderley Edge, when it was named, what is it meant to be on the edge of?
So the edge refers to the escarpment. So it's it's cut into a hill basically. So that's what the edge is.
Okay.
The name Alderley itself is in the Domesday Book. And there has been far beyond my abilities to puzzle through it. There is a debate about how we might read the way in which some of the place names in that area are broken down. We see the word elf appearing quite a lot, but we think it's probably a personal name rather than the magical elves. But there is some scholarly debate about that. But yeah, Alderley Edge appears in the Domesday Book. The edge itself is it's on the very edge of a sandstone escarpment.
Thanks.
Probably should have led with a map of the site.
Thank you so much for your paper. I was so struck by the academic hood standing for the wound and being so associated with cowardice. And I think you mentioned that was more to do with maybe scientific methods more, but maybe I misunderstood. But I would love to know more about what that says about maybe academic methods and how academics work, and maybe a self-preserving kind of energy.
That's a really good question. I think a lot of this comes from Alan Garner's mistrust of academics and his sense that actually endeavours to study the legend are best left to those with kind of lived experience of the site. In terms of our project, we do have support from, happily, from his charity. I think because it's a project which is committed to listening to the stories of people at Alderley Edge rather than attempting to write our own. But yeah, there is a real mistrust, I think, and it is not unique to Ghana. of the ways in which an academic education, whether we think about that in the arts and humanities or we think about that as astrophysics, limits your understanding of the world. And I think it comes from a very similar place to the refusal of the two magic workers I spoke to previously to talk to interviewers or to anyone engaged in sociological study of the site. The idea that people can prove your legend wrong or prove your myth wrong. And I think it's that discomfort we get when academic or authorized knowledge kind of butts up against types of knowledge which are experiential or demand a kind of necessary suspension in some way of your critical faculties. And that's something it's really hard as an academic to do when you're writing about this material. And it's so easy to, I think, to dismiss some of those perspectives or to laugh at them. But I think now reached a point where with a straight face, I can say that it is possible for people to have a belief in fairies that means something to them today. And while it is not a belief I share, it has a kind of credibility to it in terms of their worldviews and means something. And I think that's what Garner's getting at in terms of the academic hood, not fairies specifically, but the idea that that kind of education is limiting. I think it's worth saying that he may have Oxford particularly in mind, not the greenness of the hood, but the presence of the hood and kind of official academic robes. And he has his own kind of complex relationship to that institution. So it's partly, I think, autobiographical, but there is a kind of broader lesson we've tried to take from it in our writings on the project. What's your sense of that? Do you have a sense of academic
limitation? Thank you so much for your answer. That's beautiful. And yeah, that makes complete sense. And I just love the idea of the idea of it being associated with like loving your life somehow, and the idea of especially academia now and academia as it works now being so individualistic and everyone's trying to prove their contribution in such an individualized way. And the idea of that being a kind of cowardice is really so attractive.
I love that. Actually, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but to walk away from academia is perhaps to love your life.
Yeah, or like loving it in the wrong way is the worst thing about academia. Fetishizing your own insight, your name, and trying to.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what he's getting at, but certainly a way that we might read it from our perspective now. Borderlands is a relatively new novel. It's 2012. And I think he is aware of a very specific type of academic climate. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, and kind of building on that as well. I'm from Wilmslow, which is so, and I feel like there is that kind of conscious, like imaginative idea of almost kind of pretending things are older than they are or more real than they are, as in I say more real in the sense of like the wizard's well, which people you might not know it was carved by Garner's grandfather, I think.
I think we've been told it's great-great-grandfather, but there are a couple of different versions.
Like when I to it, I've been kind of like
an ancestor,
that it's this much older carving, and I feel like, you know, I've been up on the edge and used the map from Wisdom to navigate. And that kind of, I think it's an interesting that way of artificializing.
I'll quickly get that map up because it is actually the best map of the site, and we used to include it in pretty much all of our conference presentations about the project, just to explain where Alderley Edge was and what the different, when we're talking about the legend itself, what the different environments are. Because actually the National Trust don't give us anything as detailed when we're thinking about the site's legendary geographies, although we hope that they are now moving towards that. But yeah, you're right, it's an interesting site because it wasn't woodland. This idea of it as a kind of ancient woodland is itself manufactured. The Stanley family forested the site in the 19th century. A lot of the site's kind of cultivated medievalism, likely including the legend, come from that point in time. It's at that point where, you know, the Druid Circle is built, which is a folly, a 19th century folly at the site, where people used to like to imagine Druids would meet. So it's a site very rich in medievalism, but actually not immediately connected to the medieval beyond our contemporary imaginings of it. The site as it is today is not a medieval site. but it is very much a medievalist one. And it's kind of interesting navigating how you deal with that tension when you're talking to people for whom that kind of sense of antiquity means so much. But often there is a full awareness of that this sense that there is kind of an older magic there, although it finds some later cultivations in, you know, in line with the Stanley family's activities there. But it's a curious site to work out when we think about medieval. The most medieval part of it is the legend itself, not because I think there necessarily were prophecies of sleeping heroes around Alderley Edge in the Middle Ages, but because the wording of the prophecy itself is transmitted directly from a 15th century prophecy, which then moves into print and is circulating in Cheshire and then comes to be integrated into the legend of Alderley Edge.
Yeah, and that poet, I've read the, I think, early 19th century poem where I think it has the refrain of like to fancy that the fancy of or something like that.
Yeah,
so that,
one.
imagining that this is actually real.
Yeah, which if we're thinking about kind of contemporary or neo-pagan beliefs at the site, Matt's really interestingly onto that, because I think increasingly there's a sense, and Diane Perkins has written about this, that when you're thinking about pagan beliefs, you're thinking about a kind of subjective, objective reality of choosing to believe in things that you know are not factually true, you know are not historical, but because they have meaning for you, you're prepared to elevate them in that way. I mean, the whole of Alderley Edge is a kind of subjective, objective reality in that way, I think.
Okay. Yeah, sort of follow up on what you were just saying, I guess. Just thinking about this kind of like subjective realities and sort of different people having their own relationships with things. I was interested in what you were saying earlier about how the National Trust has been quite kind of reticent about putting kind of interpretation into the landscapes as opposed to their houses, which is interpretation. And I wondered whether you thought that had anything to do with what you're saying now, and also sort of how you're navigating that with as you're trying to create interpretation, how do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, no, it does. It's a good question. There are two things going on here. There's because Alderley Edge is a site of special scientific interest, you can't be interventionist in terms of kind of material signage, or you can't suddenly put a house there. You have to be really careful with how you manage it. And they also don't want to increase footfall to the site, which is really interesting and not a problem most heritage places have, but because it's eroded, they don't want more people to come. They want the people who come to behave responsibly and to kind of feel a sense of its significance, whether we're thinking scientifically, environmentally, in terms of the legend. So what they want is to give people a sense of how its meaning and significance might be understood. The most obvious way to do that is, we suggest, is through an engagement with the legendary. But we need to think about the legendary in ways that are inclusive, in ways which don't necessarily speak to fantasies of whiteness and kind of locality in the way they might. So how we offset that is actually quite hard. It's something we're trying to still work through. But one of the ways we can do that is through digital interventions. So an app that asks people what they think of the site, how they experience it as they come there, without giving them actually too much prior interpretation, giving you a bit of the legend and telling you where the significant sites are, but not saying this is the authorised version. It has been passed down since the 19th century. You have to feel about Cheshire in this way, or Alderley Edge in this way, for this site to be meaningful for you. So trying to decenter some of that, and that's the work we've been doing with the app. So rather than giving people too much discursive content, we're giving them a snippet of what the legend is, and then music and artistic interpretation. So that's one strategy. There is a real reluctance on the part of the National Trust, and actually most people involved with the site, to engage with some of the histories of witchcraft around Alderley Edge, partly because it's led to a lot of graffiti and rocks, which they want to dispense with. But there is so I don't know if any of you know about this, the history associated with Alex and Maxine Sanders at Alderley Edge in the 60s. So kind of really high profile media events performing rituals. Wiccan rituals at Alderley Edge in the 60s, and that's something the National Trust are quite uncomfortable about. But I think in terms of openness to kind of wider pagan responses to the site, I think in the course of our project that start to open up a bit, and that, you know, acknowledging that there are people who are very kind of keen stakeholders of this place and are practicing magic there, but aren't pretending to raise people from the dead and calling the Manchester Evening News. I think the realization that there is a distinction between those groups of people is something I hope we've been able to bring to the National Trust's attention. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry, but it's a good question.
I just wanted to ask quickly if your stakeholders are aware of the sort of Gawain country aspect to it. Is that something that comes up a lot?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. Those who are, I think, are kind of key readers of Garner and Simon Armitage. I think that's
right. So they come to it through the modern retellings, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a generation who were aware of Ralph Elliott's work, kind of making the national news. So there is an awareness of that. The point of mediation for a lot of it is Garner, but then there are these kinds of curious incidental echoes we get, which I don't think are necessarily coming quite through Garner, but speak to a kind of way of writing about Cheshire landscapes that is coming from Geoffrey Monmouth, Gawain and the Green Knight all the way back, because that material is getting reworked in 19th century accounts of the legend, which people are reading and telling. And the legend of Alderley is really curious because it moves in and out of oral and literary culture. So we have it written down in the 19th century, but then people seem to be retelling different versions of it into the present. So I think there is actually a kind of direct long legacy that people maybe aren't aware of, but are through a kind of curious twist of fate realizing. But there is, you know, a very direct awareness of Garner and Gawain.
Yes.
Yes, that was fascinating. Thank you. I was just wondering if in you know the Gawain country really, if there's other locations that are getting this attention or might get this attention in the future. So I'm thinking of North Wales and also Holyhead. Holywell.
St Winifred's,
and I mean, I was brought up quite near there. And also, I was at the University of Manchester, so I had a sort of links with Alderley Edge too, and you know, heard stories about sort of witch cults and couples. But and also with the Holywell, with the beheading of Saint Winifred. I think is it Gillian Rudd has made a connection with that and the Green Knight. And I mean, I suppose there's some conflict there really with it being a religious site in that way of I mean, with the Arthurian legend, there's obviously just a Grail quest on it. I just wondered if there was any possibilities of any developments of broadening the map out really.
As far as I know, there isn't, but it's something I would love to do. Unfortunately, not all of the locations within this legendary space are managed by the National Trust, so me being able to draw them into one big project is not quite as simple as it might be. But I'd love to think about Lud's Church next and what we might do there. I don't know if there is necessarily a tension between the religious or hagiographic context of a site and its kind of legendary significance. I think it very much depends kind of what people are doing there and how, you know, expansive we might be in our interpretation. But yeah, I imagine that if we're thinking about Holywell, it is a slightly different question of how you might manage it.
I'm just wondering if the well is run by Catholics, and that might be more restrictive.
I think we probably wouldn't encourage kind of. I don't know actually. I honestly don't know. But yeah, there is a kind of. There's a lot of interesting work going on at the moment around St. Scott's hagiography on the border, and I think there are very brilliant people who are equipped to do that. In a way, I think I'm not. My work is ordinarily kind of secular stuff, but Lud's Church I would love to work on. Lud's Church is even harder than Alderley Edge though, because it's even more in the middle of nowhere. You can get a train for Alderley Edge, you can't really get a train to Lud's Church. And you don't have a car park, there's a lot of infrastructural stuff that would be quite hard to manage, but I look forward to somehow realising that. Good question, thank you.
I don't see any questions online. I don't know if there's anybody online who has a question for Vicky. Nothing's appeared so far. So this is the last call for any questions for people listening online. If you want to write something in the chat box, you're most welcome.
I was just sort of wanted to broaden it out a little bit because you're talking about a novelist in Ghana, and I just wondered that thinking about place and text, a place I'm interested in my research is here at Bristol University, because I'm not at Bristol University, I'm at UWE, but it's Angela Carter, who was one of the most famous alumni and studied medieval literature, you know, as you know, with Basil Cottle and John Scattergood, and what I'm interested in is the influence of Middle English on her fiction, and also what I've been, because she was here for 10 years and she wrote the Bristol trilogy, and there's a lot of influences. But my research is actually on a novel that she wanted to write, which was a science fiction version of Sir Gawain.
Oh, right, yeah.
And which is the Infernal Sheets of Dr. Hoffman, which she wrote a long time after she left Bristol. But I think there's an awful lot of echoes in there. So the place actually is here, and it's Sir Gawain, and it turned into a novel that's probably got the living in Japan. So just
interesting, I read that novel years ago. I didn't even pick up on the Gawain reference. That's kind of amazing. But Gawain really is kind of subject to these incredible regional locations and retelling. There's I think Jeanette Winterson has a sci-fi novel based on Gawain. I can't remember the name of it, but it does pop up and is kind of really productive for thinking about all kinds of places. And I think that in terms of its connection with Alderley Edge, I think everybody knows that the story has nothing to do with Alderley Edge. That's kind of the point. It becomes movable to similar types of landscape formations. And I guess because actually the poem itself seems so oddly specific, and yet we don't quite know where the Green Chapel really is. So it gives us that kind of space to write into it.
Okay, well, I think we might draw this to a close. There's still tea and coffee if anybody wants to stay and have a drink. Is there anything else to drink, Abby? Yeah, and a real drink as well, worth staying for. So thank you to everybody online who attended online. Thank you. It's really good to have your company. Thank you, and thanks to everybody for coming today. And please join me in thanking Vicky.
Thanks for coming.